Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to try to cover a really complex topic, the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, and, particularly their impact on developing countries.
Okay.
We've got this great interview with Alex Gladstein to guide us. And he kind of presents this idea that they might be tools of, get this, financial colonialism.
That's a really interesting perspective. I think it's fascinating how these organizations came out of like World War II,
Right.
the Bretton Woods conference. I mean, the world was in pieces.
Yeah.
And the idea was, okay, let's create some stability,
Right.
help rebuild, Europe, Japan. And actually, in a lot of ways, that worked.
It did, yeah. But when do we start seeing that shift toward, this idea of financial colonialism?
Well, Gladstein really points to the period after decolonization. So think like the 1960s.
Okay.
Many former colonies are gaining independence.
Right.
And this is where the IMF and the World Bank, they really expand their focus to the developing world.
Okay, so walk us through that a little bit. So, we know the IMF deals with, countries in crisis, right?
Yeah.
They give them loans to stabilize their economies.
Exactly.
World Bank is more about long-term development projects like infrastructure.
Right. More like the building blocks of, trying to get an economy up and running. But the thing is, how these institutions are structured, that's where it gets interesting.
Yeah.
Both based in Washington, D.C.
Right.
Governance heavily influenced by major creditor nations, particularly the U.S.
So, you start to wonder, is it really serving the needs of these developing nations? Or is there something else going on?
Yeah.
And that kind of brings us to the core of Gladstein's argument. He's saying that instead of military force, the weapon of choice now is debt.
That's his idea. Yeah. Debt becomes a way to maintain control in this system.
It's interesting, right?
So the IMF and World Bank offer loans.
Right.
But a lot of times they come with these high interest rates.
Right.
And it can be really hard for developing countries to escape that cycle.
And he uses this really stark statistic, which is that since 1982, more money has flowed from poor countries to rich countries than the other way around.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
Right. Because I thought development aid was supposed to go from the richer countries to the poorer ones. What happens when it's going in the opposite direction?
Well, it challenges this whole notion of aid. What is it really doing?
Right.
And what does it mean for the long term? Can these countries ever really be independent if that flow is going in the wrong direction?
And then that brings us to this whole idea of structural adjustment.
Ah, the infamous strings attached.
Yeah, tell us about that. What are those strings attached to these loans that the IMF and World Bank give?
So structural adjustment policies, they're basically a set of conditions that countries have to meet
Okay.
to receive and repay loans.
Okay.
And it's basically telling them how to manage their economies. And Gladstein lays out 10 key policies that often get imposed. So, for example, currency devaluation, that's a big one,
Yeah.
makes imports more expensive, which can really hurt consumers.
Right.
Often, cuts to social programs are on the table.
Like healthcare, education, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And that can obviously have devastating consequences for people who are already struggling.
But doesn't, the IMF, don't they argue that these policies are necessary to make these economies more attractive,
Yeah.
to, boost their exports?
Well, yeah, they say in the long run, it's going to help them become more stable.
Right.
But we have to look at what's actually happening.
Yeah.
What are the real world effects?
Yeah, what are the results of these policies?
Exactly. And Gladstein, he uses this example of Bangladesh and shrimp farming.
Oh, okay. I know Bangladesh has had a, kind of a tough time.
It has.
How does shrimp farming fit into all this?
So back in the 1980s, Bangladesh is encouraged to convert a lot of its rice paddies, which they use for food, into shrimp farms for export.
Wait, so they're taking their agricultural land that they're using to feed their own people?
Yeah, they had to drill holes in dikes, flood the fields with salt water, catch young shrimp from the ocean.
So they're basically destroying their own ability to produce food.
And for what?
Yeah.
To produce a luxury good that they themselves can't even afford to eat?
So they're prioritizing exports over their own domestic needs.
And it gets worse. Deforestation of mangrove forests, those are like natural barriers against cyclones.
Yeah.
Gone.
So they're more vulnerable to natural disasters.
Exactly. Plus, the surrounding farmland gets all salty, can't grow anything else. The whole ecosystem is messed up.
So it's like this real tension between what they're saying about development
Yeah.
and what's actually happening.
Yeah, it's complicated.
It makes you think, who's really benefiting from this? Are we, in developed countries, enjoying cheap shrimp at the expense of, the environment and people in Bangladesh.
It's a question we have to ask ourselves, and this case study, it really shows this bigger trend. This push towards export-oriented economies in the developing world produce stuff for us in the wealthy nations. And Gladstein is arguing that this system, this focus on exports, often at the expense of local people and the environment, it can be seen as a kind of exploitation.
A subtle form of exploitation.
Yeah.
And what happens when a country, they're burdened with all this debt, they're struggling with these policies, and they just can't make the payments? Does the IMF step in and, help them out, offer a better way?
Not really. What usually happens is more loans.
Oh, so they just keep getting deeper and deeper in debt?
Yeah, it's like refinancing the old debt. They call them standby agreements. It's basically a credit line. Keeps the money flowing, but the conditions get tighter and tighter.
It's like kicking the can down the road,
Yeah.
but the can gets heavier each time.
Exactly. And then there's this whole issue of odious debt.
What's that?
Debt incurred by dictators or corrupt regimes, the kind of debt that never really benefited the people in the first place.
Right.
Gladstein gives the example of the Democratic Republic of Congo under Mobutu Sese Seko. Yeah.
Millions in loans, basically squandered or stolen.
The country gets poorer.
And so the question is, should the Congolese people today be responsible for Mobutu's bad decisions?
Yeah, so you've got this moral dilemma, right?
Yeah. It doesn't feel right to saddle people with debt that they had nothing to do with.
Yeah.
But wiping it out has huge consequences for the lenders.
So Gladstein is saying this cycle of debt, it's not a bug, it's a feature of the system.
That's his argument. It's built in.
Wow.
And what's even more concerning is the IMF and the World Bank themselves, they seem kind of trapped in this cycle too. They have to keep lending more and more just to keep things afloat. And it makes you wonder, is this just how powerful nations operate?
Is this just what happens? Any nation with enough power is going to exploit weaker nations for their own benefit. I mean, it's a disturbing thought.
It is.
And Gladstein, he draws this parallel between the IMF and World Bank and what China's been doing with their Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah.
Massive loans for infrastructure projects in developing countries. And there's a lot of concern that those loans, they come with their own strings attached.
And that China is really just looking out for their own interests. Access to resources, markets, maybe at the expense of the local people.
It's a really interesting parallel. Are there genuine differences in China's approach, or is this just the same thing with a different flag? Gladstein seems to think it's more of the latter.
So we've got this whole web of exploitation, debt, unintended consequences. Is there any way out?
Gladstein has a really radical idea.
What that?
Bitcoin.
Bitcoin. How's that going to help?
His argument is that Bitcoin, because it's decentralized and neutral, it could offer developing countries a way to escape the control of institutions like the IMF and World Bank.
Oh, okay.
He also thinks it could disrupt the global Cantillon effect.
What's the Cantillon effect?
So the idea is that whoever's closest to the source of money creation, they benefit the most.
Okay.
Governments, financial institutions, they get the new money first. But ordinary people, especially in developing countries, they get hit with inflation.
So Gladstein's saying Bitcoin would create a level playing field. Everyone's operating on the same system, and the benefits of, sound money are distributed more fairly.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
Developing countries could break free from this cycle of debt and dependency and achieve genuine economic sovereignty.
I mean, it's a bold vision. There are obviously questions about how realistic it is.
Of course, especially given the technological challenges in a lot of these countries.
Absolutely. But we should explore these challenges, right? And think about Bitcoin's potential to disrupt the system as it is.
Yeah.
But before we get into all that, we have to pause for a second and think about the human cost of all this.
You're right. Gladstein makes this point. No one has ever calculated how many people have died because of these policies. The IMF and World Bank's structural adjustment programs.
It's chilling when you think about it.
Yeah.
Behind all the economics and statistics, there are real people whose lives are being affected by decisions made so far away.
It's a tragedy, and it makes you wonder, is anyone being held accountable for this? And that's the real problem, isn't it? This lack of transparency, this lack of accountability. Gladstein says nobody has ever been held responsible for this, all the suffering.
So where do we even start with a problem this big? It's almost like, are we really going to challenge these powerful institutions?
It feels daunting, right? I mean, the IMF and World Bank, they have so much influence.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean we're powerless. Like any change, it starts with awareness. We got to educate ourselves, and then we can educate others about what's going on.
Right. And there are organizations out there, right? Groups that are trying to, hold these institutions accountable.
Absolutely.
We can support them. We can get involved. And I mean, even as individuals, we can make choices in our own lives.
Right, like every day. Think about the products we buy,
Yeah.
where they come from, the companies we invest in. Those choices add up.
It's like using our voices, our wallets, our votes to push for something better.
Exactly. And speaking of choices, we have to talk about where these loans are actually going. Gladstein points out this really disturbing pattern.
Yeah, he talks about how these institutions often end up lending money to dictators
Corrupt regimes.
who then just use those funds to, enrich themselves or oppress their own people.
It's a classic tactic, happens all the time.
And he gives examples, right, from the Cold War era.
Yeah, dictators like Tito in Yugoslavia, Ceausescu in Romania, Nyerere in Tanzania.
And they all basically bankrupted their countries, inflicted incredible suffering.
And it's still happening today. He draws a parallel to China's Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah. With all those infrastructure loans, there's this concern that, they're being used to advance China's interests.
Not necessarily the interests of the people who are supposed to be helped by these projects.
So as a reminder, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Be skeptical of all forms of development assistance, no matter who's offering it.
We got to look beyond the fancy words.
Exactly. See what's really happening. Are these projects truly benefiting the people, or are they mostly serving the lender?
And even Gladstein, when he talks about Bitcoin, he says it's not a magic bullet.
It's not going to solve everything.
Right, like Bitcoin alone can't fix poverty, inequality, lack of education.
All these deeper issues, they need to be addressed too.
Absolutely.
But what Gladstein's saying is Bitcoin could change the game
Okay, how so?
by taking away the power of governments and central banks to manipulate money.
So how would that empower developing countries?
Think about it. They wouldn't be at the mercy of these inflationary policies that are dictated by powerful central banks.
Right.
They wouldn't be forced to take on all this unsustainable debt just to participate in the global economy.
So Bitcoin could be a path towards economic independence.
Exactly.
But, I mean, come on, there are practical challenges too, right? Like implementing Bitcoin in countries that might not have the best technological infrastructure.
Of course, that's a real concern. Internet access, electricity, educating people about how to use it, it's not easy.
Yeah.
But I think the point is the current system is failing millions of people.
Right. We can't just stick with the status quo,
We have to explore new options.
even if they seem radical.
Yeah. When you consider what's at stake, the lives being lost, the potential that's being wasted, it becomes an urgent matter.
Absolutely. So Bitcoin might not be perfect, but it's a different way of thinking about money and power.
It's about control.
Yeah.
Who has it and how does it affect people all over the world?
Gladstein, he actually makes this comparison between the deaths caused by these IMF and World Bank policies and, the deaths that resulted from the agricultural policies of dictators like Mao and Stalin.
Wow. That's a strong comparison.
It is. But he's arguing that while these policies might not be as obviously violent, they've also led to millions of deaths.
Through poverty, hunger, disease.
And Gladstein doesn't shy away from saying that the success of the West has come at a cost.
The exploitation of developing countries.
Yeah. It's a hard truth to face.
But we have to face it. Acknowledge our role in this system. It's the only way to move forward.
We can't ignore the suffering or pretend that we're not connected to it.
We have a responsibility to do something, to use what we have to make a difference.
So this deep dive, it's been pretty intense, pretty disturbing.
It has.
But I think it's been important. We've learned about the history, the impact, the alternatives.
And most importantly, we've talked about the human cost. The millions of lives lost because of decisions made by people who are so far removed from the consequences. And that's the takeaway, isn't it? Understanding what's happened, acknowledging the harm that's been done, that's the foundation for creating something better.
A future where financial colonialism is a thing of the past.
A future where every nation, every person has the chance to thrive.
And it's not just about charity. It's about fairness.
Justice.
It's about making sure that these economic systems, they serve humanity.
Not the other way around.
I think that's the message we need to hold on to. We've explored the history of the IMF and World Bank, their impact on developing countries, and the potential for alternatives like Bitcoin. But it can't stop there.
We have to take action.
We each have to ask ourselves, what role do we play in this, and what are we going to do to change it?
Gladstein said it best. Understanding the past is the first step towards building a more equitable future. A future where every nation, every single person has the opportunity to reach their full potential.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you'll keep exploring these issues. Read Gladstein's full article. Dive deeper into those specific country examples that really stuck with you.
And ask yourself, what can I do? What can we all do to make a difference?
Keep questioning, keep learning.
And keep diving deep. It's easy to forget, when we talk about finance and economics, it's not just numbers.
Right.
These are real people's lives.
Absolutely.
Their health, their kids' education, their ability to just feed their families.
And Gladstein leaves us with this really powerful challenge. He says no one has ever really sat down and calculated the human cost of all of this, the number of lives lost or diminished by these policies, the IMF and World Bank.
It's a sobering thought.
Where do we even go from here? What can we actually do to shift this system? It feels so big, so entrenched.
It's a huge challenge, no doubt. The IMF and World Bank are incredibly powerful institutions. But I keep coming back to this idea, change has to start somewhere. And it usually starts with awareness. We've started that process here, having this conversation.
And we can continue that, right? Educating ourselves, talking to others about these issues.
Absolutely. We can also support those organizations that are out there fighting for change, the ones holding these institutions accountable, pushing for different models of development, ones that prioritize human rights, sustainability, all of that.
And we can make choices in our own lives too, right?
Every single day. Think about what you buy, where you invest your money, who you vote for. Even those small choices can make a difference.
It's like we have to align our actions with our values.
Yeah, exactly. And Gladstein's point about the success of the West being subsidized by the deprivation of so many people in other parts of the world, it's a hard truth to hear.
It is. But I think we have to hear it.
Yeah.
It forces us to look in the mirror and acknowledge our own role in this system.
And once we see that, then we can start to dismantle those structures that create and perpetuate this inequality.
We can't just pretend that we're not connected to this suffering. We are.
And we have a responsibility to do something about it.
To use what we have, our voices, our resources, to advocate for a world where everyone has a chance to thrive.
And it goes beyond just charity.
It's about justice.
It's about building a world where our economic systems actually serve humanity, not the other way around.
That's what we've been trying to get at in this deep dive, right? Understanding this whole history of the IMF and World Bank, the impact they've had, and thinking about alternatives like what Gladstein proposed with Bitcoin. But that's just the beginning.
It is. It has to be.
Each of us needs to think about our role in all of this. And what are we willing to do to change it?
Like Gladstein said, understanding the past, that's the first step to building a better future. A future without financial colonialism. A future where every nation, every single person has the chance to live up to their full potential.
Thank you for going on this deep dive with us. We hope you keep exploring these issues. Go read Gladstein's full article. Dig a little deeper into those specific country examples that really resonated with you. And then ask yourself that question. What can I do to make a difference? Keep asking those questions. Keep learning. And keep diving deep.